She does not belong at this table. The Dowager Duchess of Ashford spoke the words without lowering her voice. She had never lowered her voice for anything in 64 years of living, and she was not about to begin now, in her own dining room, surrounded by 37 guests who had traveled from London and Bath and as far as Edinburgh for the autumn gathering at Ashford Park. She did not turn her head, she simply said it, clearly and precisely, in the direction of her son at the head of the table, and then raised her wineglass and waited. The dining room did not erupt. There was instead a suspended moment, the particular kind that forms when 37 people simultaneously choose not to speak. Candles burned in their sconces. Crystal caught the light and scattered it across the white tablecloth in fractured pieces. At the far end of the table, near the door that led to the servants' corridor, Georgiana Haverstock set down her pencil, closed the small notebook in which she had been recording the evening's seating adjustments, and looked up. She had been sitting at that chair for 40 minutes, not as a guest. There was no place card for her, no crystal glass waiting, but because the final arrangement of the table had required someone to cross-check the diplomatic precedence of the Earl of Sutton against the preferences of the visiting Baron Ashby, and the only person in the house who had memorized both the 1811 precedence register and the Baron's well-documented aversion to sitting adjacent to anyone connected with the Whitmore family, was Georgiana. She had done the cross-check, she had corrected the arrangement, she had been about to leave when the guests began filing in, and she had simply stayed still, which was sometimes the wisest thing a woman in her position could do. She looked at the Dowager. She looked at Dominic Ashford, Duke of Ashford, who sat at the head of the table with his hands resting flat on the cloth, and his eyes, dark and unhurried, fixed on something just to the left of his mother's carefully arranged hair. He had not moved, he had not spoken. He looked like a man in the middle of making a decision, not struggling with it, but completing it, the way a key finishes turning in a lock. Then he rose. He did not push back his chair with any particular drama. He simply stood, the way tall men stand when they have decided to stand, and he walked the length of the table, past the Earl of Sutton, past the Baron Ashby whom Georgiana had maneuvered into the correct seat, past the assembled faces of 37 people, who were now watching him with the concentrated attention of those who understand that something is happening, that they will be required to report accurately later. He stopped beside Georgiana's chair. He extended his hand. Not to help her up, not to escort her from the room. He extended it, palm up, with the particular deliberateness of someone making a public record. "Miss Haverstock," he said, quietly enough that the nearest guests had to lean slightly forward to hear. "Would you do me the honor of sitting beside me?" Georgiana looked at his hand for a moment. She thought about it, which was the way she thought about everything. Then she placed her hand in his, and rose, and walked with him to the seat that had been left empty at his right, the seat that had been left empty all evening, in the way of things that are arranged without being spoken. Behind them, the Dowager Duchess set down her wineglass. The room found its breath again, eventually. But it was not the same room it had been 60 seconds before. It never would be again. Georgiana Haverstock had been making things work at Ashford Park for 4 years, 11 months, and, if she was precise about it, and she was always precise, 22 days. She had come to the estate at 24 with a letter of introduction from a solicitor named Edmund Calloway, who had been her father's friend, and was now the administrator of an estate that had nothing left to administer. Her father, a scholar of modest means and immodest intellectual generosity, had died in the November of her 23rd year, leaving her a good education, a love of order, and no inheritance to speak of. He had also left her, inadvertently, the habit of looking at a complicated problem and identifying the 3 things that needed to be done first. She had learned that habit watching him manage his library, which contained 1,400 volumes in no particular order, until Georgiana was 9 years old and spent a summer organizing them by subject, then by date of acquisition, then by the frequency with which her father actually reached for them. He had found her on the 3rd day of this project and stood in the doorway watching her for several minutes without speaking. "You have rearranged everything," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "It will take you longer to find anything for 3 days, and then it will take you half the time it used to." He had studied her arrangement for another moment. "You've left the Greek histories nearest the chair," he observed. Because you reach for them most, she said. He had smiled. Then, in the way he smiled at things that delighted him, a slow, specific smile that took up no more of his face than was required. You are quite extraordinary, he said, and went back to work. She had kept that moment in a careful place. She had not taken it out often, but it was there. When he died, she had gone to Edmund Calloway with a list of her practical skills and a clear statement of what she was able and willing to do. Calloway had read the list in silence, then removed his spectacles, polished them, replaced them, and said, I know of a situation. It is not a comfortable one. The estate is in some difficulty, and the family is not fully aware of the degree of that difficulty. How much difficulty? Georgiana asked. He told her. She did not flinch. I can manage that, she said. I will need access to the accounts from the last 7 years, and I will need someone with authority to sign letters when I have prepared them. Calloway had looked at her for a moment over his spectacles. The person with authority, he said carefully, is the Duke's land steward, who is the source of approximately half the difficulty you are proposing to manage. Georgiana nodded. Then I will need to work around him until I have enough documented evidence to make his position untenable. Calloway had been quiet for a long time. Then he said, I will write the letter of introduction this afternoon. The estate had been in the hands of Cornelius Vane, the land steward, for 11 years. In those 11 years, Vane had developed a comfortable arrangement with a wool merchant named Parsons, who operated out of Bristol, and paid Vane a private commission in exchange for receiving Ashford's wool clips at a price some £40 below what a fair market negotiation would have produced. Vane had also been accumulating small charges against the household accounts, tradesmen's bills paid twice, materials ordered that appeared in the ledger but not in any building on the estate, 6 years of salary for a deputy steward, whose employment Georgiana could find no other record of. She had found these things over the course of her first 3 months, working at a desk in the estate office that Vane had originally placed in a storage room, presumably because he expected her to ask for a better one and could then decline. She had not asked. She had worked in the storage room, with a candle when the light failed, and she had read every account book from 1802 forward, and she had built a picture with the kind of patience that looks, from the outside, like someone simply sitting at a desk. She was not going to break for Cornelius Vane. She had decided that in the storage room, on the 4th day, when he came in and told her that certain account books were not available for her review because they contained information of a sensitive commercial nature, she had looked at him with the polite, attentive expression she had learned from dealing with people who were used to intimidating women, and she said, I understand. I will make a note that those books were withheld, and record the date and your name, and indicate in my report to Mr. Calloway that the review was therefore incomplete and should be considered provisional. Vane had stared at her. Then he had gone away and come back 20 minutes later with the books. She was not going to become less than she was. She had decided that too, on the same day, in the same storage room. Whatever Ashford Park was, whatever the Dowager Duchess thought of a solicitor's referral who arrived with a leather satchel and no visible connections, Georgiana was going to do the work. She was going to do it until it was finished, and she was going to do it correctly. In the 4 years, 11 months, and 22 days that followed, she had documented Vane's arrangement with Parsons the wool merchant, and presented the evidence to Calloway in a report of 38 pages, after which Vane departed the estate with no reference and some urgency. She had renegotiated the wool contract with a competing merchant in Bath, at a price that restored £44 per clip to the estate's annual income. She had identified and corrected 22 discrepancies in the tenant farm accounts that had been accumulating since 1808. She had managed a drainage failure in the East Fields during a wet autumn that the then-acting steward had declared unresolvable, by reading a drainage survey from 1793 and writing 3 letters to a civil engineer in Exeter, who agreed, for a reasonable fee, to resolve it. She had arranged the household accounts with a precision that the new steward, a decent man named Farrow, who was overwhelmed by the estate's complexity, relied upon entirely. She had done all of this from rooms no one else wanted. She had done it without a title, without a salary that was ever described as commensurate with the work, and without acknowledgement from anyone in the main house beyond Farrow, who thanked her every Thursday morning and sometimes brought her a cup of tea. She had not been invisible to everyone. Mrs. Agnes Holt, the housekeeper, had recognized her in the first week, not with any ceremony, but in the way of practical women who know competence when it stands in their kitchen asking sensible questions. Agnes had given Georgiana access to the household keys and a place at the servants' dinner table without being asked, and had twice, in the years since, come to Georgiana's room late in the evening to say that something needed to be dealt with before morning, and she didn't know who else to bring it to. And there had been Edmund Calloway, who visited the estate twice a year and spent one afternoon of each visit reviewing Georgiana's accounts with the focused attention of a man who had stopped being surprised at their quality somewhere around the second year, but had not stopped being moved by it. He had written her, in the third year, a brief letter that contained only one sentence she kept. "I have told several people about your work here, and I want you to know that I have used your name, not just described your function." She had kept that sentence in the same careful place as her father's smile. What she had not known, could not have known, because the correspondence had been handled entirely by Calloway and had not passed through her hands, was that one of the several people Calloway had told was Dominic Ashford, the Duke of Ashford, who had been in London managing the ducal affairs and a considerable personal grief for most of the 4 years Georgiana had been at his estate. Dominic had inherited the dukedom at 29, when his father died of a fever contracted somewhere in the course of a hunting party in Scotland, leaving a title, an estate in moderate disrepair, and a mother who had her own views about how the dukedom should be managed, which views she had not been withholding since. Dominic had taken the estate's financial situation in hand in London, negotiating with creditors and consolidating debts with the systematic competence of a man who had been trained for responsibility from childhood. What he had not been able to do from London was attend to the operational reality of Ashford Park's accounts, which was why he had asked Calloway to arrange someone capable. He had not expected the reports. Calloway sent him quarterly summaries of the estate's recovery, and Dominic read them in his study in London with the attention he gave to everything, thorough, without haste. What was unusual was that he found himself reading them twice, not because they were unclear. They were exceptionally clear, but because they contained something he could not entirely account for, a quality of mind that showed up in the margins. Georgiana's summaries included annotations, not explanations, because she wrote for someone she expected to be intelligent, but cross-references. A note that the drainage expenditure in September corresponded to a reduction in tenant complaints that had been logged in 1807, and should be expected to reduce by a similar proportion over the next 2 growing seasons. A note that the renegotiated wool contract, if the market moved as it had moved in the 3 comparable periods she had identified in the previous decade, would add not 44, but potentially £62 per clip within 4 years. She was not guessing, she was reasoning, carefully, from evidence. He had set down the 3rd quarterly summary and sat with it for some time. He had asked Calloway, in his next letter, about the person preparing the reports. Calloway's reply had been brief and precise. Miss Georgiana Haverstock, 27, no family connections of standing, excellent judgment, works without supervision, has managed every operational crisis at Ashford in the past 18 months, without troubling anyone. He had added, in the kind of postscript that contains the thing the letter was actually about, "I believe, Your Grace, that she is the reason the estate is no longer in difficulty." Dominic had put the letter away and done nothing with it for 6 months, during which he had managed several London obligations and attended several events he did not enjoy, and had occasionally found himself returning, in quiet moments, to the image of someone sitting in a storage room at a desk he had never seen, reading account books by candlelight, finding things. His mother had been corresponding with Lady Honoria Devereux about the autumn gathering for most of the year. Lady Honoria was 31, connected, well-regarded, and had been understood by everyone in the relevant social orbit to be the natural conclusion of Dominic's bachelor situation. She was not unkind, she was simply very sure of the arrangement, in the way of women who have always been the obvious choice. It was in August that Dominic told his mother he was returning to Ashford for the autumn gathering. His mother had expressed her satisfaction. He had listened, and then said, without any particular change of tone, I will need the accounts reviewed before I arrive. Tell Pharaoh to leave them as they are. I want to see them as they stand. His mother had asked, with the air of someone who already knew the answer, why he wished to review them himself, when that was precisely what they paid the estate manager to do. Because, Dominic said, I want to understand what has been built there. His mother had not pursued it further. She had learned, in 31 years, that there were certain things her son said that were not invitations to discussion. He had arrived at Ashford Park 3 days before the gathering began, in the early morning, when the house was operational rather than ceremonial. Footmen carrying linen, the cook directing deliveries in the kitchen yard, Pharaoh walking the east lawn with a notebook. He had gone directly to the estate office. He had found the accounts where he expected them, in order, but the order was of a kind he recognized only in retrospect, not the order of someone who had tidied before the master's arrival, but the working order of a system that functioned continuously and had no need of adjustment for an audience. Every ledger was dated at the last entry. Every cross-reference was penciled in a consistent, precise hand. On the corner of the main account desk was a small notebook, closed, with a single word written on the front cover in the same hand, current. He opened it. Inside was a list of 17 items, 17 operational matters in various stages of resolution, each dated, each with a note on its status, each with a projected completion, and a contingency if the projection failed. 3 of the items were marked complete since the previous week. Times Amelet. One of them, a dispute between 2 tenant farmers over a fence line and a drainage ditch, had a note that read, Resolved, 14 September, verbal agreement witnessed by Pharaoh, written agreement to follow when I can get both parties in the same room at the same time, which may require patience. Dominic had stood in the estate office for a long time, reading that notebook. He had set it back, precisely where he had found it, and had gone to find Pharaoh. Tell me, he said, about Miss Haverstock. Pharaoh had looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has been hoping someone would ask exactly this question for approximately 3 years. Then he began to talk. He talked for 25 minutes. Dominic listened to all of it. That evening, he had walked the house, not the formal rooms prepared for the gathering, but the working rooms, the corridors. It was late, past 9, and most of the staff had retired. He heard, when he passed the music room at the end of the east corridor, the sound of a piano being played. He had stopped. It was not a performance. It was someone playing alone, in the way people play when they are not aware of being heard, with small pauses, with the occasional correction, with the quality of a private conversation. The piece was one he recognized without being able to immediately name, and it was the not naming of it that kept him standing in the corridor, the sense of something familiar coming at him from an unexpected direction. He stood outside the closed door and listened for the length of the piece, and then for the beginning of a second piece, which resolved itself after 2 minutes into a composition he knew precisely, because it had been his mother's piece, the one she had played every Sunday morning when he was a child, before the years that had taken the lightness out of her, before music had become one of the things she set aside. He had not moved. He had stood in the corridor until the music stopped, and until he heard, through the door, the quiet sound of the piano lid being lowered and the bench being pushed back. He had gone to find a chair in the library, and sat in it in the dark for some time. He had gone back the next night, and the night after that. On the 3rd night, she had opened the door. She had found him there, standing in the corridor as he had been standing, in his tailcoat without the coat, in his shirt sleeves, because he had been reviewing papers in the library, and had not anticipated a walk down the east corridor, and she had looked at him without alarm, with the particular stillness of someone who is used to encountering unexpected things, and has developed a policy of assessing them before responding. Your Grace, she said. Miss Haverstock, he said. There was a moment. She looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has just understood something and is deciding how to arrange it. The piece you played on the 2nd night, he said. The one after the handle, how do you know it? She studied him. I found the sheet music in the red drawing room, she said carefully, when I was cataloging the music library 3 years ago. It had a name written on it, but the ink had run. I learned it because it was interesting, and because no one else was playing it." He was quiet for a moment. "It was my mother's composition," he said. "She wrote it in 1798. There were 3 copies, and I believed the others lost." Georgiana looked at him steadily. "I did not know," she said. "I would not have played it if I had thought it private." "I did not say that," he said. "I am glad you played it." He paused. "I am glad you found it." She considered him, a tall man in shirt sleeves, standing in a corridor at 10:30, who had been standing there on 3 consecutive nights, listening to her play his dead mother's music, and had not once interrupted. She thought that was an unusual kind of attention for a man of his position to give to anything that did not require it. She said, "You could come in, if you wished. There are 2 more pieces I haven't worked through yet." He had come in. He had sat in the chair near the window, and she had returned to the piano, and she had played for another hour while he sat without speaking, not with the careful attention of someone being polite, but with the settled quality of someone who has arrived somewhere they needed to be. The gathering arrived 3 days later. Lady Honoria Devereux came with her mother, and her certainty, and she was, Georgiana observed with the impartial clarity with which she observed everything, genuinely lovely. She wore a gown the color of old ivory, and managed a room the way an experienced captain manages a vessel, with invisible adjustments, with a light hand on every social instrument. She knew Dominic's name in 3 different registers: the formal, the warm, the intimate but appropriate. She stood next to him at the drawing-room reception on the first evening and smiled at the right moments, and she was entirely correct by every measure available. She was also, Georgiana noted, looking at Dominic the way people look at things they expect to own. Not cruelly, simply with the particular confidence of someone who has never had a reason to doubt. The gathering required Georgiana's attention in ways that went beyond the music room and the accounts. 37 guests meant 37 sets of requirements, and the requirements had begun arriving in her notebook 3 weeks before. The Baron Ashby's dietary restrictions, the particular feud between Lady Sutton and Lady Marchmont that made adjacent seating at any meal an act of diplomacy, the need for a footman who spoke French to be assigned to the wing housing the Comte de Rouchard, the discovery, made 4 days before the gathering, that the East Wing linen had been improperly stored and would require airing, and that 3 of the guest rooms needed fires set a full day early to address a damp that had accumulated in the August rain. She had managed all of it. She had managed it from a small writing room off the housekeeper's corridor, with Agnes Holt as her primary ally, and a footman named James who had proven, over the course of 2 years, to have a gift for quiet efficiency that Georgiana had rewarded by giving him increasingly complex tasks and speaking to Pharaoh about his advancement. She had not expected to be in the dining room on the 3rd evening. She had intended to finish the precedence cross-check and leave before the guests arrived. She had miscalculated the time by approximately 7 minutes. It had not, on reflection, been entirely a miscalculation. Lady Honoria had noticed her, in the dining room, in the same way that people notice things they consider out of place. She had said nothing. She was too polished for open unpleasantness. But her gaze had moved across Georgiana with the measuring quality of someone assessing a disruption to an arrangement. The Dowager Duchess had been less restrained, because the Dowager Duchess had never found restraint particularly useful. And then Dominic had risen, and walked the length of the table, and extended his hand. The morning after the dinner, Georgiana was in the estate office at 7 o'clock, as she always was. She had her notebook and her accounts and a letter from a tenant farmer named Hodges about a fence dispute that had not yet been resolved to Hodges's satisfaction, which was going to require another conversation and possibly a surveyor. She was working through the letter with a pencil, annotating the specific claims and identifying which were supported by the original lease agreement, when the door opened. She expected Pharaoh. It was Dominic. He had come without ceremony, in the way she had already learned he moved, without announcement, without performance, simply present. He was in his riding coat, which meant he had been to the East Fields already, and he had a document in his hand that she recognized after a moment as one of the wool contract amendments she had drafted and sent to the Bath merchant in September. "There is a clause on the 3rd page," he said, setting it on the desk in front of her, "that I want to understand." She looked at the clause. It was one she had written specifically to address a risk that the standard contract form did not account for, a provision that allowed for renegotiation of the per-clip price if the Bristol market moved more than 12% in either direction within a 12-month period. She had added it after reading 3 years of market records and identifying a pattern that suggested volatility in exactly this cycle. "You are protected from a significant loss if the market drops," she said, "and you are entitled to renegotiate upward if it rises." The merchant accepted it because I offered him an extended term in exchange. He values the certainty of a long contract more than the flexibility, which is a reasonable position for a merchant of his size. Dominic looked at the clause, and then at her, with the measuring attention she had first seen across the dining room. "How many contracts of this type have you reviewed?" he asked. "Wool contracts specifically, or estate contracts generally," she said. "Both. 11 wool contracts. I obtained copies from Callaway of comparable estates arrangements. 43 estate contracts of various types over the course of 4 years here." She paused. "I also read your father's original contracts from 1804 through 1809, because I wanted to understand the baseline from which Vane had deviated." Something moved across his face, not quite surprise, and not quite its absence. "And," he said, "your father was a competent negotiator," she said. "His contracts were sound. Vane did not deviate on the contracts themselves. He deviated in the execution, which is harder to detect without access to the accounts on both sides." She looked at him steadily. "I had access to both sides, eventually." Dominic was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I would like to understand the full picture of the estate's position. Not a summary, the full picture." He looked at her notebook. "How long would it take you?" She thought about it. 3 hours, she said, "if you can stay." He sat down in Pharaoh's chair. She took him through it from the beginning, the state of the accounts as she had found them in 1817, the specific mechanisms of Vane's arrangement with Parsons, the recovery she had built over the subsequent years, the current position, and the projections she had developed for the next 5 years based on 3 scenarios of market movement. She showed him the ledgers. She showed him the annotated wool contracts. She showed him the drainage survey from 1793, with her own notes alongside the civil engineer's report, and the calculation she had made about tenant farm productivity in the East Fields. She presented it without flourish, pointing to figures when the figures mattered, and moving past them when the context was more important than the number. He asked 7 questions in 3 hours. Each question was precise and demonstrated that he had followed everything. When she reached the 5-year projections, he was quiet for a long moment, and then said, "You expect the estate to be debt-free in 4 years. In 3 years and 8 months if the market cooperates," she said. "In 5 years and 3 months if it moves badly." He looked at the projection sheet. "And if it moves badly," he said, "what is the contingency?" She showed him. She had already written it. He had been watching her for several minutes before he spoke again. "Miss Haverstock," he said, "I want to ask you something that is not about the accounts." She waited. "The piece you played in the music room," he said, "the one my mother wrote. Will you play it again?" She looked at him. It was not the question she had expected. "Now," she said. "Not now," he said. "Tonight. If you are willing." He paused. "I would like to hear it again, and I would like to be in the room for it, rather than outside the door." She considered him the way she considered everything, directly, without evasion. "I will be in the music room at 9:30, she said. He nodded, and rose, and said, "I will be there at 9:30. He came. He brought nothing with him, no book, no papers, no armor of busyness, and he sat in the chair by the window where he had sat before, and she played for an hour. His mother's piece first. Then the handle. Then a composition of her own that she had been working on for several months and had not played for anyone, which she played now without quite acknowledging that she was doing so. When she finished, there was a quiet in the room that felt like something settled. "That last piece," he said. "I don't know it." "No," she said. "It's mine." He was still for a moment. "It's extraordinary," he said. It was not the word she had expected. She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the piano, where no one could see, and said nothing. He had his coat draped over his arm. He had carried it from the library, because the evening had turned cold, and without particular deliberateness he set it around her shoulders. She did not move. It was warm, and it smelled of wool and a very faint trace of cedar, and she sat with it on her shoulders, and looked at the piano keys, and thought that she had been cold in this house for nearly 5 years without quite noticing it. "The dinner," she said, after a moment, because it needed to be addressed. "What I said, what you—" She stopped. She was precise in the wrong direction, which was unusual for her. Lady Honoria Devereux expects a particular outcome from this gathering. "Yes," he said. "I know. So does your mother." "Yes," he said again. "I know that as well." She turned to look at him. "And?" she said. He met her eyes with a steadiness that had nothing defensive in it. "Lady Honoria is an excellent woman," he said. "She would manage my household well and my social obligations better. My mother is correct about that." He paused. "She is not correct about everything." Georgiana waited. "I have been reading your reports for 4 years," he said. "You write the way my mother played the piano. Precisely, and with a great deal underneath that doesn't need to be stated. I came to Ashford 3 days early because I wanted to understand what kind of person writes like that." He looked at her steadily. "I have understood it, I think." She thought about saying several things. She said, "That is a great deal to conclude from account books." "The account books told me you were capable," he said. "The music room told me something else." She did not ask what. She thought she already knew. He left an hour later, taking his coat with him. She straightened the music, closed the piano, and returned to her room. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and thought about the decision she could see forming on the horizon, the way you can see weather coming in from the east when you know the sky well enough to read it. She thought about it carefully. She was not a woman who made consequential decisions quickly. The opposition, when it organized itself, did so in the efficient way of things that have been waiting for a reason. Lady Honoria came to find Georgiana the morning after the dinner, in the estate office, with the composure of a woman who has decided to address a matter directly. She was, Georgiana observed, genuinely brave in her way. She did not send a maid or arrange an intermediary. She came herself, and she sat in Pharaoh's chair without being invited, and she looked at Georgiana with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who has taken an accurate measurement. "You are very competent," Lady Honoria said. "I gather that is not in dispute." "I would not think so," Georgiana said. "Dominic needs someone who can manage Ashford's position in society, as well as its accounts," Lady Honoria said. "Those are not the same skills." "No," Georgiana agreed. "They are not." Lady Honoria looked at her. "Can you manage both?" she asked. It was not a rhetorical question. It was the question of a woman who is losing and wants to know if she is losing to someone worthy of the prize. Georgiana set down her pencil. She looked at Lady Honoria with the direct attention she gave to everything that deserved it. "Lady Honoria," she said, "I have been managing the diplomatic seating arrangements for this gathering for 3 weeks, including your own placement, which required negotiating 2 competing precedence claims and 1 well-established personal aversion. I did not manage it brilliantly, but I managed it correctly." She paused. "Whether that answers your question, I cannot say." Lady Honoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He has already decided, hasn't he?" She said it without bitterness, with the resigned precision of someone reading an accurate report. Georgiana said, "I believe you should ask him." Lady Honoria rose. At the door, she paused. "You should know," she said, without turning, "that his mother will not make it easy." She left without waiting for a response. The Dowager Duchess made it clear, not through cruelty but through the structural machinery available to a woman of her position, that she considered the situation an error of judgment. She did not say so to Georgiana directly. She said so to Dominic, and she said so at dinner, on the 4th evening, in the presence of 6 guests, who had been carefully selected for their willingness to agree with her, and she said so in a letter to Calloway, that Calloway, with characteristic precision, showed to Georgiana, along with his own response, which was 3 paragraphs long and very measured and contained, in its final paragraph, a sentence about the documented record of Georgiana's management of the Ashford estate that Calloway had constructed from 4 years of quarterly reports. Dominic, for his part, called his mother to his study, on the 5th morning of the gathering, and closed the door. Georgiana did not know what was said. She learned some of it later, from Agnes Holt, who had been in the adjacent room, and had heard enough to know that the conversation had been long, and that Dominic's voice had not risen once throughout it, and that the dowager had emerged with the expression of a woman who has encountered a wall she did not expect to find, and is currently deciding how to revise her approach. It was Calloway who came to Georgiana on the 6th day, arriving from London with a traveling bag and the air of a man who has received a letter requiring his presence, and has not delayed. He sat across from her in the estate office and set his satchel on the floor and said, without preamble, "There is going to be a formal review of the estate's management." She looked at him. Requested by whom? The dowager's solicitor, acting on her behalf, has written to the dukedom's primary creditors. There are 3 remaining, each holding a note, suggesting that the current management arrangement involves an inappropriate relationship between the estate manager and the duke, and that the accounts may have been shaped to support a personal interest rather than the estate's. Calloway's voice was entirely level. They have requested a formal review before the notes are renewed. Georgiana was quiet for a long moment. She picked up her pencil, set it down, and looked at the accounts on her desk. "When?" she said. 3 weeks. The review panel will be 2 of the creditors and a senior solicitor of their choosing. He paused. It will be held in the estate's formal library, with Dominic present and the relevant parties given the opportunity to present evidence. She considered this. "The accounts are accurate," she said. "I know they are," Calloway said. "I have reviewed every quarterly summary." He looked at her steadily. "The question is not whether the accounts are accurate. The question is whether you can present their accuracy in that room, to those men, in a way that makes doubt impossible." She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. She spent the 3 weeks preparing. She had always kept accurate records, but accuracy for the purpose of an adversarial review is a different instrument than accuracy for the purpose of management. She assembled the ledgers in chronological order, annotated the key entries with cross-references to the supporting documents, invoices, letters, market records, and prepared a separate set of written summaries for each of the 3 creditor notes, showing the exact state of the debt at the moment she had arrived, the trajectory of repayment since, and the projected date of full resolution. She added, in an appendix that she numbered carefully and indexed, a comparison of the estate's performance against 3 comparable estates in the same region over the same period. She asked Farrow to provide a written statement about the estate's operational management since her arrival. He provided 4 pages, handwritten, which she read without editing. She asked Agnes Holt for the household accounts from her first month. Agnes provided them without comment, along with a brief note that read, "I have worked in this house for 22 years, and I have never seen it managed better." She had been managing impossible things before breakfast for nearly 5 years. She could manage this. The review was held on a Wednesday, in the 3rd week of November, in the library at Ashford Park. The 2 creditors were men she had never met, a merchant banker named Stanhope and a land investor named Rowe. The senior solicitor was a man of 50-odd named Harcourt, who looked at her when she entered the room with the particular expression of a person who has been told one thing and is in the process of revising it. Dominic sat at the long table, to the left of the panel's designated space. The Dowager Duchess was not present. She had been asked, Georgiana later understood, not to attend, and had agreed with the grudging compliance of someone choosing her battles. Calloway stood to Georgiana's right, as her representing solicitor. She placed her ledgers on the table. She placed the annotated summaries in 3 organized stacks, 1 for each creditor note. She placed the appendix at the center of the table, then she looked at the panel and said, "Gentlemen, I am prepared to address any question you have about the management of this estate since the autumn of 1817. I would suggest we begin with the accounts." They began with the accounts. The review lasted 4 hours. Stanhope asked about the Vane period first, about the discrepancies she had identified, and how she had identified them. She showed him the ledgers, side by side, and pointed to the specific entries, and showed him the invoice records that did or did not correspond. She showed him the letter she had written to Calloway, documenting the withheld account books, dated and signed, on the 4th day of her tenure. Stanhope looked at the letter for a long time. Rowe asked about the wool contract, specifically about the clause she had added. She explained it, as she had explained it to Dominic, with the same precision and without any reduction of its complexity. She showed him the market records that had informed the clause. She showed him the 3 comparable years she had identified. He asked a follow-up question about the extended term she had offered the merchant in exchange, and she answered it, and then she showed him the contract itself, where he could read the exact terms. Harcourt, the senior solicitor, asked the harder question. "It has been suggested," he said carefully, "that your interest in the favorable presentation of these accounts may have been influenced by personal considerations related to your position in this household." Georgiana looked at him steadily. "My interest," she said, "is in accurate accounts. I would refer you to page 43 of the documentation before you, which contains a letter I wrote to Mr. Calloway in the spring of 1819, 3 years before the Duke's return to Ashford Park, proposing an amendment to the wool contract. The letter was written before I had any personal acquaintance with His Grace whatsoever." She paused. "The standard of work you are reviewing was established before there was any personal dimension to establish." Harcourt looked at page 43. He looked at it for some time. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. At the 2-hour mark, Anamic rose, not dramatically, but with the particular finality of a man who has been waiting for a specific moment. He said, "I would like to state, for the record of this review, that I retained Miss Haverstock's services through Calloway and Associates, on the basis of the work she had already done, before any personal consideration arose. I would further like to state that the estate's recovery from significant financial difficulty to its current position is documented in its entirety in the materials before you, and that I have reviewed those materials personally and in full." He paused. "I am not asking this panel to take my word for it. I am asking this panel to read what is already written." He sat down. Stanhope and Rowe exchanged a glance. Harcourt made a note. At the 4-hour mark, Stanhope set down the last ledger and said, with the tone of a man whose objection has been answered more thoroughly than he had anticipated, "The accounts appear to be in order." He looked at Georgiana. There was something in his expression that was not warmth, exactly, but was the specific recalibration of a man who expected something less and was finding it difficult to say so cleanly. "The notes will be renewed," he said. Rowe nodded. Harcourt closed his folder. Georgiana gathered her ledgers. She did not rush. She organized each stack with the same precision with which she had assembled it, because she had built this work carefully, and she would close it carefully. Her hands were entirely steady. It was Calloway who came to stand beside her as the panel rose and began their private consultation. He said nothing. He simply stood there, which was, she had learned, his particular way of saying everything required. Dominic came to her as the room was clearing. He stood before her, and she looked up at him, and she thought she had never seen him look so specifically like himself. The contained, deliberate quality of him, the way his eyes were dark and direct and entirely present. He said, quietly, so that only she could hear, "You carried 4 years of work into that room, and made it speak for itself." "It is accurate work," she said. "It should speak clearly." "Not everything accurate is heard," he said. He looked at her with the measuring attention that was, she had understood by now, his form of care, the way he expressed things that he did not otherwise express. "I want to speak to you. Not about the accounts." "I know," she said. He had asked her to come to the library that evening, and she had come, and the fire was built up, and the room was warm, and there were no papers on the table between them, nothing operational, nothing that required management. He had been standing when she arrived, and he remained standing, and she sat, because she thought better sitting, and this was a conversation she intended to think through clearly. "I am going to propose marriage to you," he said, without preamble. She waited, because she could hear from the way he said it that there was more. "I want to be clear about the terms," he said, "not because I am uncertain, but because you deserve to hear exactly what I mean." He looked at her. "I could construct a reasonable case based on the estate's interests. You know the accounts, you know the tenants, you know every mechanism of this place better than anyone alive. That case would be true. It is not the reason." He paused. "I stood outside a closed door for 3 nights, because I needed to hear your music. I sat in a storage room of an estate office, reading a notebook about a fence dispute, because I could not put it down. I have never encountered a mind that works the way yours does, not because it is without feeling, but because the feeling is entirely beneath the surface, doing the actual work." He was still. "Not because it is convenient or appropriate or fitted to the requirements my position imposes, but because you are the most extraordinary person I have encountered in 34 years, and I would like to spend the rest of those years in the same rooms as you." Georgiana was quiet for a long time. She looked at the fire, she looked at her hands. She thought about her father's library, and the letter from Calloway that had used her name, and the storage room, and 4 years, 11 months, and 22 days of work that she had done, because she was not going to step aside for anyone, and because she had decided, in a storage room by candlelight, that she was not going to become less than she was. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. He crossed the room. He took both her hands, bare, because she had come without gloves, which was a small domestic failure she had not intended, and did not regret, and he held them with a careful, specific pressure, and he looked at her, as though she was the thing he had been reading toward for a long time, and had finally found on the correct page. "I should tell you," she said, "that the fence dispute with Hodges is still unresolved, and the east wing linen needs to be rotated before winter." He looked at her. Something moved through his expression that was not quite a smile, and was entirely warm. "I know," he said. "We will manage it." They were married in February, at Ashford, in a ceremony attended by Calloway, by Agnes Holt, who wore her good dress and stood in the front row without apology, and by a young footman named James, who had been recently promoted to under-steward, and stood near the back, with the expression of someone who has been watching something develop for 2 years, and is gratified to see it properly resolved. Dominic's mother attended. She sat in the second row, correctly dressed, and she watched the ceremony with the expression of a woman who has revised a position she held for a long time, and is not yet comfortable saying so. She did not speak to Georgiana during the breakfast afterward. But at the end of the afternoon, as the guests were departing, she paused beside the fireplace in the east drawing room, where Georgiana was straightening a chair that had been displaced, and she said, without warmth but without contempt, "You may find that managing this family's affairs publicly is different from managing its accounts." She paused. "I expect you will manage it." She left before Georgiana could respond. Georgiana stood with her hand on the back of the chair, and thought that this was, in its way, the most the dowager had offered, and that it was more than nothing, and that she would take it as the partial thing it was. Their son was born 17 months after the wedding, on a cold morning in July, when the east light came through the bedroom windows at a low, golden angle that Georgiana had always found particularly clarifying. They called him Edmund, for Calloway, who received the news by letter, and wrote back a single paragraph that ended, "I have never been more honored by the use of my name." Edmund had his father's dark eyes and his mother's habit of looking at everything in a room before he touched anything, which became apparent by the time he was 4 months old and confirmed with increasing certainty in the months that followed. Georgiana returned to the estate accounts when Edmund was 6 weeks old, not because anyone required it, but because she had a system and the system needed maintaining, and also because sitting at the account desk with the morning light coming in, and Edmund in a basket beside her, occasionally waving a fist at nothing in particular, was one of the most content arrangements she had ever known. She revised the wool contract again that autumn, incorporating 3 additional protective clauses based on 2 years of market movement that confirmed her earlier projections. The revised contract was adopted, within the following 2 years, by 4 neighboring estates, through Calloway, who distributed it with full credit to the name on the document. She wrote a set of annotated account guidelines for Faro, a detailed, practical document that addressed the management of estate accounts in the specific conditions of an agricultural estate, navigating shifting market conditions and creditor relationships. Calloway had it copied and sent to 6 other estates he administered. By 1824, 11 estates in the southern counties were operating with some version of Georgiana's account system, adjusted for their particular circumstances, but built on the same architecture. The same insistence on cross-referencing, on contingency planning, on treating the written record as the primary instrument of protection for everyone the estate touched, from the duke to the smallest tenant farmer. James, the under-steward, eventually became the head steward of Ashford, having learned, as he told Agnes Holt once with considerable understatement, almost everything he knew about running an estate, from watching someone who made it look simple, because she had made it genuinely orderly. The evening that Georgiana remembered most often, in the years that followed, was not the dinner or the review or the proposal, or even the wedding. It was an evening in the 3rd year of their marriage, when Edmund was walking steadily, and had recently discovered that the corridor between the library and the east drawing room was an excellent distance for running. Dominic was reading in the library when Edmund escaped through the door Georgiana had not latched correctly, and he was halfway down the corridor at full speed before Dominic looked up and rose from his chair, not with alarm, but with the focused calm of a man who has learned that children in motion require interception rather than pursuit, and went after him. Georgiana appeared at the library door just as Dominic caught Edmund at the far end of the corridor, lifted him with his coat opening around both of them, and turned back. Edmund was delighted. Dominic was looking at his son with an expression Georgiana had never seen on him in any social setting or formal occasion, entirely unguarded, the contained quality of him entirely absent, replaced by something older and simpler. He looked up and found her watching from the doorway. He did not say anything. He simply looked at her with the steady, measuring attention that was his form of everything, and she thought, standing in the doorway in her working dress with ink on her right hand, and her hair loosely pinned because it had been a long day, that she had been seen, at last, precisely as she was. She smiled at him, a small, specific smile, not performing anything, not producing anything, simply present. He carried Edmund back down the corridor toward her, and the fire was built up in the library, and outside the windows the November dark had come in early from the east, and they were all 3 of them warm,